An absolutely perfect phone call to the new president of Ukraine. That was a perfect call.
Had a perfect phone call with the president of Ukraine. Perfect. The phone call was perfect. The perfect phone call. I made a perfect call. Not a good call. Perfect call. In fact, a friend of mine who's a great lawyer said, did you know this would be the subject of all of this scrutiny? Because the way you express yourself, this is like a perfect call. It was a perfect call. In fact, it was two perfect calls. A perfect phone call. An absolutely perfect call.
The thing is, however, we keep learning new details surrounding that July 25th phone call that the president has repeatedly called perfect with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky. The Washington Post reports 29 times in the past 3 months, President Trump has used Twitter to implore the country to read the rough transcript of his July 25th call. President has also instructed his GOP allies to use a similar defense, writing on Twitter back in November. The call to the Ukrainian president was perfect. Read the transcript. There was nothing said that was in any way wrong. Republicans, don't be led into the fool's trap of saying it was not perfect, but is not impeachable. No, that is much stronger than that. It is much stronger than that. Nothing was done wrong. One annoying small fact to inject here. We never got a transcript. We would, in fact, love to read a transcript of the call. We were given a summary by the White House, and there is already sworn testimony that the summary is wrong. It's incomplete. Be that as it may, isn't it still all about words? And to that end, it is our great pleasure to say, back with us again is John McWhorter.
John, there he is.
Linguist, often pushed into the position of Trump explainer, for which he comes armed with a PhD in linguistics from Stanford. These days, a professor at Columbia University, contributor at The Atlantic, importantly, the host of Lexicon Valley podcast at Slate, and the author of over a dozen books in his spare time. Thank you so much. When you're not here, we're thinking about what we're going to ask you on your next appearance.
That's so wonderful to hear.
As my mom would say, that beats a poke in the eye with a sharp stick.
Note, folks, John McWhorter was my neighbor, and he is still my friend. We were regulars at the Alley in Oakland. He is now, as you heard, professor at Columbia, and here is John McWhorter.
Which is that you should do a show on that, please.
I actually will.
Phraseology. Perfect phone call. Not in the recorded human history have I ever heard a phone call described as perfect, because it's such an imperfect vehicle to start with. So the news media is now calling it a perfect call, ironically. His base is calling it a perfect call, seriously. A friend of mine is Ron Popeil, maybe the best marketer of the last half century on television. This is marketing, introducing a concept we didn't know existed before, and by sheer weight of insistence and repetition, making it a thing.
It's interesting calling a phone call perfect, and that wasn't just a tick. When I first read that, I thought that's just the way he happened to put it when he was sitting there eating Funyuns and typing one night, but he uses it over and over again. And it's interesting, you usually call something perfect when you're rating it from a distance, and often in a kind of a tacky way. It's as if he's judging some sort of beauty contest or something. It was perfect, which shows you how far he is from thinking about what the issues really are, with why people have certain issues with the content of the call. And of course, the marketing part comes in that there's a complete disconnect when it comes to him and his people with the objections that a lot of us have to the appropriateness of that call. The details are just utterly ignored. They're not playing the same game that we are. They're not indulging in facts and reasoning. They're doing something else because they see themselves as having a higher purpose. They think that there's a larger story and that history will pardon them. But the problem is that the larger story is clearly built on sand.
What about when you look behind him at a rally and someone has handed the crowd read the transcript t-shirts? We can't. We would love to read the transcript. We were given a summary replete with gaps and ellipses.
And of course, if we actually could read the transcript, the people who are reading the t-shirt probably wouldn't read the transcript. The issue here is not what the transcript would say and what it would say about whether or not the president was doing something that was inappropriate. We're supposed to look away from all of this completely. We're supposed to think of the phone call as perfect, the way somebody's bathing suit might be perfect. And we're supposed to think that the larger issue is what? The idea is that he's not a details man, that there might be some things that he did that we might call tacky, but that there's something larger. But unfortunately, the larger issue is simply the president's narcissism and bucking him up. And so unfortunately, what I see when I see these things, such as somebody using perfect in that way over and over again, the eccentric capitalization, the vicious abuse of people without any thought of it, all of this is based on two things. Anybody who works for this man is either a cynic or, and Brian, this is the hard part, we as polite American people have been trained to not talk outwardly too much about some people having more mental candle power than others. It's considered tacky, especially if you have a college degree. But I think we have to understand that when it comes to a lot of this, it's not a matter of Trump and his people having a strategy. We're talking about people, frankly, Trump, of course, and then many of the people who work with him. These people are working on a lower level than a lot of other people. These people aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer. There is a reason why, for example. Notice how easy it is to imagine the president in private moments trying to put M&Ms in alphabetical order. You notice that that feels kind of plausible? It's because we are talking about people who aren't thinking on that high level. And if that sounds snotty, well, you know what? It is. The problem is that we have people like this who are running the nation. It's impossible to have a productive dialogue with people who are working on that level.
In modern day America, did the phrase quid pro quo ever stand a chance?
Frankly, I'm afraid that their reasoning about these things is not what we would expect. We're expecting close reasoning and exchange. These people are flying above it with the idea that there are larger issues at hand, when in fact the large issue is simply whether or not Donald Trump snaps the towel properly in the locker room and wins. And that's all it is. That's what was accidentally allowed into the White House.
The Democrats are having their own argument. Should it have been called bribery or extortion from the get-go and not a Latin phrase? Our guest has agreed to stay with us over the break. Coming up, the president asked his audience just days ago for a word at his rally, and they knew exactly what word he wanted, and they shouted it back at him. We'll talk about the word, its import, and all things verbal right after this.
When I met John, he was actually dating a woman who was a friend of our current mayor, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf, and we would all go down to the alley. So John then left the Bay Area approximately 10, 11 years ago, met his now current wife, and they have two beautiful children. And he has, by his own admission, found his bliss in New York City. We'll be right back with the second half of what John has to say on MSNBC.
Trump got the crowd to do the weirdest call and response I've ever heard.
Sinks, right? Showers. And what goes with a sink and a shower?
His crowd knew the answer was toilets. And a second later, he renewed his strange feud with flushing. Check this out.
I did. Wow, not me, it was not me. But you.
So some poor guy in his audience waited in line outdoors in Michigan in December to support the president. He gets inside, the president points at him and says, "This guy destroys toilets."
Colin Jost, who went to Harvard University, by the way, taking on Donald Trump. As you may know, this riff the president does on toilets goes back to something he must know about the new plumbing standards and tank sizes. That has become flushing 10 to 15 times, which strikes me would call up the need for a doctor more than a plumber, perhaps.
Usually, yes.
But what about his control verbally over a crowd that knows the next word he's looking for?
You know, what he is oral. Frankly, what he reminds me of is how human language emerged. We tend to talk in little packets of 7 to 10 words at a time, not in the long sentences of the Wall Street Journal. And language is about conversation. It's a lot about emotion and rhythm. And if you're dealing with a society that is before writing, then an awful lot of convincing people is based on intonation and on rhythm and on energy. That's the way it goes. The printed page is a very artificial thing. It really transforms your mentality. And so what he's doing is he's being somebody who demonstrates that He, I guess we should say, doesn't happen to be a reader. This is not a man of the printed page. And so what he's holding is a rally. And so everything that he does in the name of politics has the atmosphere of something that you would usually expect at some kind of sporting event. And that includes the low level of vocabulary necessary to having a sporting event. You don't need to have verbal subtlety at a sporting event. You wouldn't want it. But the problem is that he takes that kind of atmosphere, that kind of going for the gut, and brings it into leading a nation with no sense of the fact that you're supposed to at least make a stab at grandeur. He often reminds me of Lyndon Johnson, who was not the most refined person, was not the most supremely educated person, but came to the office and knew that he had to pull his gut in. You hear little stories about stuff he did in the bathroom, talking about toilets, etc. But that was scuttlebutt, and you didn't know as much about it at the time. He tried to project an image because he was running a big and important country. Trump doesn't have any sense of that.
This is, we've checked, and Lyndon Johnson never flushed 10 to 15 times while president. This next bit is a name that must have triggered something in Trump back to an age where in a tough school you'd make fun of kids' names that were beyond the ordinary. So this became a name trigger that ended up making fun of a guy who served in the House from 1955 to 2015.
You have this Dingle. You know Dingle from Michigan? Debbie Dingle, that's a real beauty. So she calls me up like 8 months ago. Her husband was there a long time. But I didn't give him the B treatment. I didn't give him the C or the D. I could have. Nobody would have, you know. I gave the A+ treatment. She calls me up. It's the nicest thing that's ever happened. Thank you so much. John would be so thrilled. He's looking down. He'd be so thrilled. Thank you so much, sir. I said, that's okay, don't worry about it. Maybe he's looking up, I don't know.
So many things going on there. I'm duty-bound to point out that the Endangered Species Act, Clean Air, Clean Water, Civil Rights Act would not look the same, arguably, without John Dingell in Congress. He represented Michigan. That's where the rally was. Dingell, you could hear the repetition. It sounds funny to him. The joke about him looking up from hell. Even the pro forma nature of being president and allowing a burial with full military honors. He's buried in Arlington for a World War II veteran. He assigned that to kind of favor status, but it started with the pronunciation of the name.
You know, it's interesting. He's sitting there using the name, and he's implying that it sounds like some kind of genital, and well, isn't that funny? But of course it reminds you of, you know, Uncle whoever, that counselor at camp. Everything about the man is easy. It's always easy. And so, for example, never mind the history of the man who he's talking about, his significance. Donald Trump has the historical sense of roughly a kitchen cabinet. The past doesn't matter except as possibly it flatters him in the present. Once again, it's about orality. Before you can write history down, people tend to preserve history in their heads, often with some one or two people who remember the history. And the history tends to be massaged to fit the needs of people living difficult lives in the present. Just mastering details such as what Franklin Pierce's wife's name was is not important if you don't have paper to preserve those meaningless details. That's what he's doing, and so he has this pre-literate sense of how history works. And then just the meanness. And if you talk to an actor, they'll often tell you that as fascinating as it is to watch somebody being angry in a play, anger is easy. If somebody doesn't know how to act yet, it's fairly easy to have a tantrum on stage. What's difficult is getting on stage and conveying things such as genuine happiness or remorse or ambiguity. And notice how those three things are utterly alien from anything we've seen of Trump. What you see is a certain joy in making fun of other people. This is a truly inferior person to be leading this nation. And the bit with Dingell, he ought to be utterly ashamed of himself. And yet, as we know, life will go on, and that thing could possibly be reelected because that's how life works. We've unleashed something that's truly frightening.
This is the day we begin booking your next appearance. Thank you
hope so.
very much. Tell the good people watching the name of your podcast again.
The podcast is called Lexicon Valley, and please listen to it because I do it and I enjoy it.
And he uses words throughout, I'm told. John McWhorter has been kind enough to join us once again. We're back with more right after this.
Wow, Zanny, you
Nice job, John. And my mom, that's my mom applauding you. I don't know why you're so embarrassed to be seen, Mom.
Because I didn't get ready.
Anyway.
That guy was absolutely fabulous.
My mom thought you're absolutely fabulous. I just know you. So anyway, great job. And I have to have you on my show sometime we can talk Trump. Folks, subscribe to Zenny62 on YouTube and bookmark my newest blog, oaklandnewsnow.com. And don't forget my flagship blog, Zenny62blog.com. And follow me on Twitter at ZENNIE62, Zenny62. See ya.